in general, what makes one pen a hard starter and one an always reliable starter? And does brand or price factor into it all, or perhaps ink as well? Let's throw paper in there too. You know, it's like, yeah, all these things can come into play. I kind of hesitated to take this question a little bit, Kevin, to be completely honest with you, because it's so broad. There could be so many different reasons and explanations for why a pen is a hard starter. So I'll try to kind of cover all the high points as best I can. But a lot of it, though, boils down to the nib and how it's tuned. That's a lot of it. You know, definitely there are factors with paper and ink and writing pressure and angle and all this other stuff. But basically, the nib and like the way that it mates up to the feed and everything is a big factor in how a pen is going to start or how it's going to write. So definitely, yeah, certain nibs brands models are known for being more or less reliable than others. You know, you can look at all these different reviews. We have a lot of product reviews on our site. You can see what tends to be more reliable than others. So certainly that could be the case, because the way that it ends up working is a lot of pen companies will you know, use nibs across different pen models. So you'll see, like, if one pen model uses the same nib as another pen model, it's going to write very similarly. So there's things like that that you could take into account. But not every nib is made custom for every pen that's out there. You know, think about, like, I've got Goulet nibs, right? I get them from Jowo in Germany. Edison uses Jowo nibs as well. And so there's several different manufacturers that use Jowo, basically a Bach and Jowo in Germany. And those are both nib companies that make probably easily 90% of the nibs in the world. You know, I think that's pretty safe to say that. Maybe that's not an exact accurate figure, but it's probably pretty close. Then you have other manufacturers like Lamy, Pilot, Platinum that make their own nibs for their pens. And that's cool. They can do that. I think Omas does that too. But you don't, you know, you don't necessarily have like super consistency across all brands and models and stuff like that. So you do kind of need to take that into account. And then price definitely comes into account as well. You can certainly have an expensive pen that's a hard starter. You can certainly have a cheap pen that writes very reliably, you know. A lot of it comes down to quality control, how much time is spent in the QC process, how complicated the pen, you know, honestly, like one of the best, most reliable writing pens and with the smoothest, you know, kind of all around nib I've used that I could recommend is the Pilot Varsity, which is $3. You know, it's a little disposable pen, but the dang thing always starts up and it's really, really reliable. And I've got other pens that are hundreds of dollars that, you know, you can hardly ever get started. So it gets kind of frustrating when you think like, well, I'm paying a lot more for a pen, it should write so much better. And yeah, technically, it really probably should write better, but it's not necessarily always the case. And I have to speak in super generalities here because there's so many different pen models, so many different things going on. But in general, you can typically expect that when you're spending more on a pen, you're going to get a little more reliable writing experience. That's not necessarily always the case, but that's usually the case. And there's usually like a threshold there, like especially once you get up into the gold nib pens. Once you get into gold nibs, that's when manufacturers really are paying more attention to quality control and stuff like that. Not that they're not paying attention on steel nibs, but that's when people's expectation gets really kind of high as to how reliable a pen should write. Steel nibs, it's kind of like, well, it's a steel nib, you know, and people can tweak them and adjust them themselves and they're not too scared. Gold nibs, people usually don't mess around with themselves, so they expect them to write really well from the manufacturer. So that, I think, is kind of more of a consumer expectation kind of thing. So you get a pen like the Custom 74, you're not going to get this pen and be like, oh yeah, I'll just use micromesh and smooth it down and mess with the tines. No, it's a $200 MSRP pen, you know, so you're not going to do that. You're not going to do that like you would with a $15 Metropolitan, you know what I mean? So that comes into play for sure. So as far as hard starting goes, let me talk about, you know, hard starting and maybe what could be causing that. So there's several different things. One thing that can have hard starting, and basically hard starting means you touch the nib to the page and it doesn't start writing right away. You either got to like tap it a little bit or draw in some squiggles or press on the nib a little bit to get it flowing. There's several different reasons. One could be that, you know, a nib related reason could be pinched tines. So basically, you have the tines, they're supposed to come together and almost barely touch right at the end. That's to assist in capillary action. You want them to be parallel or slightly turned into each other to assist in that capillary action, so that when you're writing, the ink has got a nice little channel to go on. If they're splayed, meaning they're going out a little bit, and let me like dramatize here a little bit. If it's splayed like that, the capillary action is going to want to work it in the reverse direction, and it's going to want the ink to crawl back up into the pen. So that's part of what can be the problem sometimes. So you want it to be either parallel or slightly turned in like that. And you can tell that somewhat when you're looking at it with a loop. Do I have my loop handy? Yeah, it's around here somewhere. Okay, I don't have it handy to show you, but it's a loop. So check out the Goulet loop video for how to like tune your nib just a little bit. You also have, okay, so I talked about pinch tines. Pinch tines basically is when it's turned in, but it's turned in so much that the tips of the nib are actually touching, or maybe even like pressed right on each other. So the ink wants to flow in, but it's kind of like losing a space there to flow through. So that could be one reason. That's a pretty easy fix. Basically, you press on the nib a little bit as you're writing, just like in little short strokes, like kind of overflex a little bit, and it'll kind of like spread those tines out. It's easy to overdo it, so don't go nuts, but you can do it just a little bit at a time, and it'll kind of spread those out a little bit. For anybody that's had hard writing issues with like Monteverde or Conklin or Twisby, they have, you know, kind of a reputation somewhat on some of their nibs of having pinch tines. It's a very easy fix if you know what to do. It takes like a minute maybe to be able to kind of flex that out and get them going again. Now if you overdo it, it's a little more complicated, so try not to overdo it as far as how to fix that. Now if you have splayed tines, that's when your tines are pointed out like that, then you're going to have usually a much more serious problem. And to get that back is kind of more of like a 102 nib tuning class. You know, there's a couple different methods that you can do. You can actually pull the nib out of the pen. You know, that would be one option, and I'm not going to actually mess with this nib too much, but you know, so you can pull it out of there, and then you can kind of bend them back in place. That gets a little risky if you don't know what you're doing. Another method that I've been told by some people that do nib work, and you may or may not want to do this method as well, is to actually pinch the tines together, and you kind of use your fingernails and you twist the top one tine over top of the other, and then you twist in the other direction, and you just do that a few times, and then it'll kind of work its way back, and then you have to readjust them because that almost always throws the nibs like the tines off of alignment there. So none of this is stuff that you should really be doing if you have no clue what's happening. But if you've messed with your nib and tines a little bit before, you might be brave enough to give some of this a shot. I wouldn't recommend doing any of this stuff unless you've got like a cheap pen that you don't care about that you can mess with. You know, that's where Goulet nibs can help. They're inexpensive enough where you can throw it away if you are terrible with it. Or like a Noodler's $2 non-flex nib are really great for that. Or if you have like a Jinhao or something like that, it can work really well. Another reason that it could be hard starting is baby's bottom. Now, baby's bottom is a term that's thrown around a lot, and I actually believe I have a question later in this Q&A about baby's bottom more specifically. But essentially, baby's bottom is a nib that you have that's really smooth, but skips or hard starts, which can be kind of confusing. It's like, what's going on? That basically, you have the tines of the nib. Now, if you're looking straight on at the nib, as if I'm going to stab you in the eye with it, you know, you're looking straight on at the nib. Here's the tip. So it's got the two tines, which are my arms. You got the ball, the tipping material, which is here. So essentially, what's happening with baby's bottom is you have the capillary action that's drawing the ink through the slit like this. And then it needs to come down as you're touching the paper, and that's the flow of it. But if you have, it's too, basically baby's bottom is when it's too rounded on the inside here. So the edges on the slit at the point where it touches the paper are too rounded, and I'm gonna try to like manipulate my hands enough. So we'll go like that, there you go. So it's like a normal nib should be kind of like this, maybe splayed just a little bit towards the bottom. But if it's too rounded, it's going to write really smooth, but there's too much of a gap here where it needs to be touching the page for the ink to consistently get down there. So usually you can tell it's a sign of baby's bottom when it writes really smooth and it has like starting or skipping issues that are fixed by when you give a little bit more pressure on the nib. So that's when you can tell, like when you give more pressure, because that flexes out the tines a little bit more and forces more ink to come down, and then it fills in that gap and it writes again. But if it's consistently doing that, that's almost always a sign of baby's bottom. Now that can be fixed. You can use a little micro mesh or a little mylar paper is usually not aggressive enough to fix that easily. Mylar paper usually does the trick, some little figure 8 patterns on micro mesh, and that will kind of wear away the bottom and get it kind of back to normal. Now you may have to do a little bit of work and figure 8 in kind of different directions and stuff, but I got a tutorial on micro mesh. I think I'm like halfway answering the question that I have later on. Yeah, sure I am. That's all right. It'll be a little bit of duplicated information here for you, but that's all right. So yeah, that's part of it. It could also be that you're having flow issues because your pen needs to be cleaned. I probably should have said that first. Always clean your pen first if you're having any starting issues. It's always good to clean even a new pen. Sometimes you can have manufacturing oils or little debris and stuff like that that are left over from the manufacturing process that can give you some hard starting issues and flow issues and stuff like that. Ink can definitely influence it as well. There's certainly drier inks like the Pelikan 4001 series or Parker Quink. Those are some really dry inks. There's some other ones out there too. They're just kind of random inks here and there, but the ink can be a big factor as well. So you can use a wetter or more lubricated ink that can help to fix those issues if you are having them consistently. But yeah, that's definitely a factor as well. And then your paper too. If you have more absorbent paper, it's going to help to fix kind of some of those issues as well. But that's a little bit of info for you there, Kevin. Hopefully that helps point you in the right direction. Little pen education.